for melodic heavy metal. Playing it heavier, louder, raunchier, faster. 99.1 CJAM. This is the Signals of Intuition.
Hey guys, this is Brandon from the Signals of Intuition. Usually when I upload these interviews, it's usually the broadcast version that goes to air, minus the music. Because this is longer than a typical show, my show runs for 2 hours. What I figure I would do is upload the entire interview with me and Paul. I've cut out just a couple little things, some minor technical glitches we had, and just some of the ums and ahs and a little bit of the pauses, just tighten it up a tiny bit. But otherwise, what you're about to hear is 99% of my interview with Paul Northfield. And if you don't know who Paul is, he's been the producer and engineer of a lot of famous hard rock bands, including Rush, Queensryche, Porcupine Tree, Dream Theater, Suicidal Tendencies, Hole, Ozzy Osbourne, Alice Cooper, April Wine, Kim Mitchell, Pat Travers, Gentle Giant. I mean, the list just goes on. And I'm sure there's a number of albums we didn't even talk about during this interview just because there's so much stuff that he's been involved with. So check out Paul, look him up, and see just the enormous discography he's been involved with. And other than that, I hope you enjoy the interview. Hey, Paul.
Hi.
How's it going?
How you doing? I'm good.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
Awesome. Yeah, sounds great on your end.
Okay, good. Anyway, well, what do you want to know?
A lot of stuff, actually.
That I will be prepared to tell you.
So what can you tell me about your early life? Where did you grow up? How did you get interested in music, that kind of thing?
Well, I grew up just outside of Cambridge in England, and I was really interested. I played guitar when I was young, was really into music and electronics and things like that. And I never joined a band because none of my friends at the school played instruments, and by the time they did, they weren't very good. And I was kind of like in a bit of a misfit in music, unlike a lot of people here in North America where everybody goes down in the basement, which we didn't have in England. Almost nobody has a basement. So you didn't have the same kind of like people hacking away with bands that you get here, which kind of is a great time to sort of work out, your abilities as a musician and just, jam around and do things like that. So I was kind of a bit of a solitary, my musical interests were quite solitary, but I used to hang out with a band that were much older than me. I was about 14 and they were about 18 to 20. And they actually were playing gigs. It was in the 70s, early 70s. And so I'd go to shows, and then they did a recording session in a demo studio, and I went along and I found that really interesting. And then one of the guys in the band, we were talking and he said, "Oh, you'd be really good at that." And I thought that was really interesting. So I was given a magazine. It was called Beat Instrumental, which is kind of like was the British version of Mix magazine.
Oh, okay.
But we're talking 1970.
Yeah.
And in it had a list of studios that basically they were advertisements for studios, and they had a list of the clients for the studios. So it started to occur to me that this was a really interesting job, and I was miserable at school, good at it. I was good, I was really good at school, but I hated, well, not so much hated, but I just was not sort of very fired up about what I was doing.
Yeah.
And so on a whim, I wrote to 3 studios. I wrote to Trident Studios, which is where Queen recorded. I wrote to Advision Studios, which is where Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer recorded, who were my favorite bands at the time. And I wrote to another studio, I can't remember, in Wembley. And I never heard back from Trident. The Wembley studio wrote back and said they'd put me on the list, and the Advision studio, which was my favorite, said have come for an interview. So it was, oh wow, okay. So I was suddenly faced with the possibility of taking it seriously and leaving school at the age of 17. And so I went and did this interview, and they told me that I'd have to leave home because I lived an hour outside of London, but you had to travel in the middle of the night. often because you'd be working till 4 in the morning sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, in my case, 49 hours non-stop. But that was the nature of the business. So so basically they said, you need to leave home. You can't do this from home and commute. So I said, oh, okay, well, I'll get back to you. So I went back home, and my parents decided that, if it didn't work out, I could just go back to school. The school was horrified that I was going to leave and tried to dissuade me and my parents. And I ended up doing it. And after I arrived, I discovered there were 40 applicants for the job, all of the others being kind of university graduates. Mm-hmm. But not that has any real bearing, except for the fact that I think they chose me because I was 17 years old, ready to make tea, run around, set up microphones, and do what I was told, which is basically what the job was. And whereas for people with a more substantial education, which a lot of the other people would have had, they obviously would be eager to be in the driving seat, because there's a romance to being sitting there in front of all the buttons and recording famous people. That being said, by the time I was 18, I was sitting in front of the console with all the fancy buttons recording Greg Lake from Emerson, Lake and Palmer.
Wow.
So for various reasons, it worked out really well for me. And it was partly because of the change in technologies that happened and the fact that I was really into kind of studying the technology, and I was, I found it very easy to understand, whereas many people in my business are very good creatively and sometimes not very good technically. And some of my colleagues that were much older than me would go to bed at night with nightmares thinking about how a patch bay worked or how things worked. And even though they subsequently went on to brilliant artistic careers, sometimes they were, it was kind of interesting like that. So my strength was technical, first of all, and I played guitar. So that was always my kind of, I always wanted to be able to play guitar and this was an in, to be able to play on a record or something like that. Anyway, as time went on, it was sort of like very obvious that this was actually a really good job. And I felt like I had to pinch myself for the first 3 or 4 years that I did it. It's like, how did I end up here? This is incredible. Because, right away at the age of 17, I was in a pretty important position. One of the first big records I worked on was Brain Salad Surgery from Emerson, Lake and Palmer.
Oh, wow.
Even though I haven't got a credit on that because I didn't always used to credit on those things at that time, but I was the assistant for the entire record. There was a couple of others before that, but that was the first one that was like where you're suddenly in a position of when people are doing editing multi-tracks and the tapes are lying all over the floor in pieces and everybody turns to you to say, whereabouts is the first chorus of the second take? And, and they're relying on you to know where that is.
In your early days, who were some of the biggest acts that you worked with then, like producers and bands? When
I first arrived at Advision, just to give it context, the very first thing I heard when I walked into the studio and sat in the control room at extremely high decibels, where at the impress the clients level or impress ourselves level, which is what was David Essex's Rock On.
Oh my God! Wow.
Which was actually an extraordinary piece of recording at the time, and went on to win awards. That was my sort of initiation into what sitting in a control room in a studio could be like. So in that early time, I was working with, I'd be an assistant to Martin Rushent, was a good somebody who I worked with a lot as his assistant on his sessions. He went on to do the Stranglers, the Buzzcocks, Human League, and a number of other things. He was, I think, the biggest thing that he was known for, I think, was Human League.
Yeah, probably.
But anyway, he was a very prolific producer, engineer, and at that time, that's essentially what happened. Is almost everybody walked into the studio and used the people that were house engineers, because it was a very early business. Every studio was different. Usually, if a studio had a reputation, it was partly on, the reputation of both the studio and the equipment and the engineers there. So at Advision, they had Eddie Offord, who used to do all the early Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer stuff. And Martin Russian was another very well-known engineer producer that came out of there. That's what the kind of stuff that I was doing. So I was very, very quickly involved in, aside from Emerson, Lake and Palmer, I did Steve Howe's first solo album. I worked on that. And then I ended up working with Gentle Giant, which was another one of the English progressive bands. That,
they were just insane.
Yeah. Well, what was interesting with them was the sheer number and complexity of the instruments that were involved in the session, because they were pretty much all multi-instrumentalists. Mm-hmm. So aside from having a very sort of hard, solid rock bass to the band sound, there was a lot of complexity in the arrangements, and also lots of interesting instruments coming in. At that time, we didn't have computers emulating every instrument under the sun. We actually had every instrument under the sun, or a large number of them. Like 20 or 30 keyboards would come parading through the studio, everything from electric pianos of various kinds, clavinovas, you name it, we saw it.
Oh, that's unreal.
So that was very fun, and I liked that. I really enjoyed their sort of eclectic, if you like, or the kind of complexity of their music and stuff, and it was fun to record. And sometimes in the process of recording, it's like, for me, sometimes the things that are the most fun to record aren't necessarily the music you listen to when you go home. Mm-hmm. For me, like, that's been true throughout my whole life. If I go home, I'm more likely to put on some trip hop or some Massive Attack and stuff like that, or Miles Davis. Whereas when I'm working these days, I do a lot of hard rock, which I love recording, but I think I burned myself out on it doing it, so I don't really need to. And hard rock is interesting because of the challenges of the intensity of the playing, and trying to find that balance between raw energy and precision and things like that. You want it to be powerful and aggressive often, but you still want clarity and things like that. So it's a constant battle, and that's one of the interesting things about it. Whereas obviously, you might find somebody who plays piano or does acoustic guitar with an extraordinary voice, beautiful to listen to, but it's not as complicated to record. So it's a different process. It's more like sometimes recording's like taking a photograph. If you just want an accurate representation with the best mic and the best instruments in front of you, and you just record it.
Yeah.
But other times you want to do, in the case of rock and to a large degree pop recording or hip hop or something, you're manipulating sounds, which is you're recording them. You don't necessarily want them to sound the way they sound in front of you. You actually usually want them to sound better than that. Yeah. So you use lots of tricks to do that. Some of which are most of the time it's from a sonic point of view, but also from a performance point of view. You obviously, when you're trying to make a record for somebody, people are going to listen to it time and time and time again. In a live show, you can get away with some errors because of the excitement and the drama of the moment. But when you know it's going to be played back again and again and again, everybody wants everything to be perfect in a way that they wouldn't necessarily feel was so important live. So we've obviously developed over the years different ways of achieving that. At the beginning, people used to go straight to stereo, cut straight to disc, and then we went to multi-tracking and editing, and then and then like multiple takes and combining takes, and now you could essentially, with a talented production team, you could take somebody that has no musical talent at all and unable to sing, and actually make a musical performance out of them. So some really great pieces of work actually are surprising, because when I hear really incredible vocal harmonies, for instance, you will immediately assume that they're all auto-tuned.
Yeah, for sure.
So, because people can't really do that. And even actually, to be honest, even if they did do it without auto-tune, they probably punched in so many thousands of times that you could argue that wasn't reality either. But anyway, our business has changed massively now. I find myself fortunate to have actually lived through it. It's actually 40 years now that I've been doing it. So I started when I was 17. I've been doing it for 40 years and seen everything change like in ways I could never have imagined. You know?
So now getting sort of back to Gentle Giant in your beginning, it seems like right after Gentle Giant for the next decade or so, you were working largely with Canadian bands, and one of the first ones I see is Pat Travers Making Magic. How did you come to engineer that album?
That one, I mixed it. It was Advision. As per the way things tended to work then, he would have just come in, but he would have booked the studio. I would have been the not necessarily most senior, but I would have had probably enough experience at that time. I would have been probably 20, I guess, at the time, but had 3 or 4 years of experience, maybe 21. I'd have had about 4 years of experience of actual engineering at that point, and I was involved in. I just mixed it. It went really well. Obviously made some good calls, and the record was great. So it's one of those things. That was the way it was then. You just it wasn't like you could turn around and there'd be a roster of 500 independent engineers that you could go and find that knew more than I did, because there might be 10 that knew how to run the studio Advision better than I did. So like I said, the studios were very, very different in terms of the kind of speakers they had, the kind of equipment they had. There was very little standardization. So people came to the studio for the whole package. So I was part of the package. That meant I got to mix the record, and it went really well, and they loved what I did. So that was the first. I didn't even realize, I think at the time, that he was Canadian. It was just, I probably did somewhere along the session, he would have mentioned it, but I didn't know anything about him. He walked in. It was a similar thing for me. Similar thing with something like Judas Priest. I actually was just an assistant on that, and I think I did some work on it. But just walking into the studio, they want to do some extra recording and some mixing and things like that. And so that was the way those things worked at that time. You'd stumble into really significant projects. I mean, I did Manfred Mann's Earth Band with Blinded by the Light. That was a mix that just came into the studio. And
oh, wow.
I worked on it. So it was, so that was the nature of the way the music business was then. There would have probably been maybe a dozen people that would go and engineer things and mix things in London. Maybe not even that. Usually they would be producing at that point. And so in charge of a project in its entirety. So if you're not producing it and there's a producer, they would just come to the studio and use whoever was there. So that's really the way it worked. So anyway, that Pat Travers album turned out great. Even today I can go, actually that really sounds pretty good, considering my inexperience at the time. But yet again, it's great pieces of music inherently. The way they're put together, the performances and stuff, it makes life so much easier. You're not fighting with things when things are performed really well and arranged really well. They fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. So it makes the life of an engineer or somebody recording much easier.
Yeah. And then so shortly after this, you came to Canada and joined Le Studio. How did that happen? Well,
I was working with Gentle Giant. I'd left Advision, which was basically because they were okay for me to do, if I could bring projects into the studio, then they didn't mind me doing the occasional going out and doing live things, which I did with Gentle Giant. I recorded them live. But when they wanted to record somewhere else and they wanted me to do it, then the studio said, well, you have to leave. You can't work for the competition, as it were. So they said, but if you leave, we'll do an arrangement. If you bring work here, then we'll pay you, the work that you bring here. So it worked out. And so I was freelancing. So I started freelancing, I think, when I was 21, which was a bit scary because you'd get a few calls to work at the same time. I had, Mick Taylor from the Stones was doing his first solo album. I started working on that, and then I needed to go to America to do something that had been planned with, actually I was coming to the studio to do some recording with Gentle Giant, or with the guys from Gentle Giant, not the band itself. Immediately I got back to England. I was no longer, I was sort of persona non grata because I hadn't been available for Mick Taylor. So You suddenly find that you're getting all the work coming at the same time, and then you'll have, months where there isn't anything, so it's pretty scary. So consequently, I did 2 independent projects where I came to the studio, and the owner of the studio, Andre Perry, asked me to join the studio. He said, "Would you be interested in coming to?" And it hadn't occurred to me to move to Canada, but the offer sort of remained open for a long time, and I set up a friend of mine with the job initially, and then that fell through. He decided he didn't want to move to Canada. But so about a year after I'd been first offered it, I decided that I would do it because being independent was chaotic and scary. So I just decided to move and thought I would be home every couple of months because we tended to work non-stop, 12, 14 hours a day for 7 days a week. That's the way you worked in studios at that time. The studios, big projects may be locked out, 24-hour days. So, well, they'd pay for a 12-hour day, but you'd have the studio locked out, so all the equipment was left set up and nobody else could record in the room. So you tended to do projects that would start and just go every day, 12 hours a day until they finished. So usually you'd have a few weeks off at the end of that. So I expected to be home, every couple of months. I'd be home for a month or something. And I didn't go home for a year and a half because I was having so much fun. It's a great place to live. I still live here, up in the Laurentians. It's a beautiful place to live.
So you still live in Montreal?
No, it's not Montreal. It's north of Montreal, about an hour, Morin Heights.
Oh, okay.
So I still live here. The Morin Heights studio, Le Studio was because it no longer exists. It was in the Laurentians, about an hour north of Montreal.
Oh, okay.
And it was a residential place, which was not very common at that time. And the value in it was that, and the very reason that we, with Ray and Derek Shulman from Gentle Giant, that I came to the studio was that they were managing and producing a band from Pennsylvania. And you would spend more money in a hotel and transportation and food doing a project with 6 or 7 people involved, and in this case it would have been maybe more than that, 7 or 8 people involved. If you go to New York or Los Angeles, you've got hotels, you've got to cater to everybody. There's a lot involved before you even pay for the studio time. So the value of a residential studio, if you had good enough technology, was that you could have really nice accommodations, and everything was right in-house, so there was no distractions. And that was the value of Morin Heights. It was very technically very well put together studio in a beautiful environment overlooking the lake with great accommodation. And so it attracted people from all around the world. And whilst I was there, I went through a period of being one of the most successful studios in the world.
So one of the next bands I see you worked with is a Windsor band called Tease on One Night Stands and Body Shots. Any memories of working with those guys?
Yes, well, it was, if I remember rightly, Miles Goodwin was producing them. Mm-hmm. So I think I did that. We did a certain amount of it, I think, at Miles's house with a mobile truck. I would imagine, I can't remember it in detail, I imagine we probably recorded the drums at the studio and then perhaps went to Miles's place. And then it's actually, that's kind of I remember the guys, I remember the band, and I remember recording it in a mobile truck. So I'm just sort of thinking, I think I was still probably on staff at the studio at that time. So I guess it was probably because we only had one studio and it was busy, and the studio didn't mind me going off and doing that because we were going to mix it. We tracked it at Morin Heights and we went back and we mixed it there. So I think we did anyway. Anyway, that's probably why, because I distinctly remember staying with Miles and having the truck parked in his driveway. So yeah, that's an oddball one actually, one I'd forgotten about. But and I, Miles was Montreal based, so he was producing them. And it was, I think, on Aquarius probably, Donald K. Donald's label, which was April Wine's label. And April Wine was a sort of, for a while, was a staple of the studio at Morin Heights. They did 3, I think, albums there, if not more. In fact, actually 4 albums, because I think Nick Lagona did the first 2 and I did the next 2.
How many records with Nick did you end up doing over the years?
Well, Nick was the the engineer at Morin Heights first, when there was just basically, it was a 2-room operation, so they needed 2 people to keep it busy, but both rooms weren't working all the time. So we would be flipping backwards and forwards and doing different projects. And because you worked literally 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and often usually at that time, an album would be at least 6 weeks, if not 2 months. And that was kind of moving fairly quickly. Later on, we got into the albums that took 6 months, 5 months, 6 months. So when you do that, like one person is not doing much for a long period of time. So we didn't used to work side by side on records so much. We did a couple of them we would have done, but him mixing or me recording or vice versa, those kinds of things. But usually one of us did one project and somebody needed a break, and there was another project coming in, and I would do the other one or something. So it was kind of like, that's the way it worked. There was, for about 3 or 4 years, both myself and Nick were, actually it may have been a bit more than that, but maybe it's 5 years that we worked together at Morin Heights.
In 1980, you joined Rush to engineer Permanent Waves. Were you aware of them at that time? Because they were still a fairly niche band.
Yes, well, yeah, because I'd seen them when I was in England. I'd seen them, I think, on the Old Grey Whistle Test probably doing their Farewell to Kings tour. So Old Grey Whistle Test was a British TV show on the BBC. And I remember seeing, Rush with the long sleeves and, Geddy playing Minnie Moog and all the sort of drama of that sort of at the end of the progressive rock era, I guess, at a time when it wasn't particularly cool. I also remember the Notorious Sounds interview that they did, where I remember reading it, where they were very much into Ayn Rand philosophy at the time, or either Neil was or the band was, and some of the lyrics were about that kind of independent thinking and stuff. And the very sort of leftist interviewer for Sounds, I remember writing that he thought that they were the nicest bunch of Nazis that he'd ever met. And I mean, they came in for some really absurd, which is ironic because, with Geddy being Jewish. So, but the British music press are a law unto themselves. They like to, I think they're more enamored with their own writing than they are with the artists and the music that they cover. It's very much that way. So they always want to discover people and build them up, and then once they're successful, they like to drag them down. So the British music press is kind of hilarious in some respects. And the Sounds, I think it was Sounds, not Melody Maker. I think it was the Sounds interview. I remember reading that, and they sounded like a really nice bunch of guys, but they had these very more right-wing or independent thinking kind of philosophy, which didn't really sit well with the lefty British music press.
Yeah. From what I understand in the studio, Rush wanted to not only experiment with their music, but also with constantly changing gear and mics and preamps and everything. What sort of gear and stuff did you use on those records, and any kind of memories of working on things like that with Rush? Yeah,
well, I can pretty much remember everything that we did because that's what I do. So, I mean, that their experimentalism. I mean, I think from a musical point of view, that's the primary reason, and there's being experimental is a sort of very creative and positive thing to do, where you just keep pushing yourself, trying things in unusual ways, using different things. But sometimes experimenting for its own sake is not always productive, because in the case of Rush, I think their musical experimentation was very productive, and sonically we sometimes were experimenting with, like changing mics for the sake of changing mics, because we'd used them on the last song and they sounded really good. So now let's try a whole bunch of different ones to get something different, which in theory is an interesting way to keep challenging yourself. But there are so many other things that come into play, and generally speaking, these days people don't do that, except for there's times when using really radical and weird, unusual recording techniques is really, really creative, and I agree with that, and I do it myself. But on another level, where if you decide to just change things because you used it last time, it's not always such a productive way to do things. So invariably, I think on both Permanent Waves and Moving Pictures, I don't think there were any two songs that we had the same miking on for the consecutive songs. As soon as we'd finished a song, we'd change a lot of the mics for no reason other than the fact that, well, we just used the other ones and let's change the new ones. And and when you listen to the record, you wouldn't necessarily know, because invariably if you choose a mic that's brighter on some instrument, then you're going to equalize it to change it back. So
yeah.
But at the same time, the experimentalism was creative in another way. Like the long form songs that they do just lend themselves to that, and hunting for unusual sounds. Now we have so much gear that makes weird sounds, you actually probably need to limit yourself more than you do. It's more like we're in an era of like multicolored photography now, where sometimes people hanker for black and white. And in recording, we've got so much technology that people hanker for simple old school recording with gear that forces you to do things in a certain way, so I mean, there was definitely a lot of experimenting going on. I'd say that, we did things like record guitar solos with speakers piped out over the lake and recording the reverb off of the lake from the guitar.
Oh, wow.
And we recorded an acoustic guitar. I remember on Natural Science, we recorded acoustic guitar sitting down by the water with somebody. I think it was either the natural sound of the waves lapping on the side of the water, or somebody was sitting there with a paddle or something like that, making it sound, giving it more interesting context and stuff like that. And on Witch Hunt, I remember us all going out in the parking lot and pretending to be a mob of angry mob mentality, screaming and shouting in the middle of the night, with using the sound effects, for the background on Witch Hunt. Mm-hmm. So we did lots of fun stuff, actually, aside from like some really intense recording and editing and things like that. So when I recorded all of up until I was involved, Terry had always done the recording, because he was an engineer as well. That was his engineer producer. And I think because I had so much experience at that time in England and doing bands that the guys were interested in, from Emerson, from Yes in particular probably, and not necessarily Gentle Giant per se, but the English music scene. I think the fact that I'd been recording English progressive rock for a long time and was obviously very experienced and competent, they decided that it was really interesting to have me do the engineering and Terry sit in the producer seat, so obviously because he comes from an engineering background, he would have a significant input in, okay, we're going to do this, let's try that, but I basically was doing the engineering and he was producing on those records. On Permanent Waves, Rush came in for, I believe it was 6 or 8 weeks. I think it was 6 weeks we did the recording every day, 7 days a week, in the fall, and then they went to England to mix it. At that time, we were recording with a Trident console, which is what the studio had, and we had a small Neve console as well, which we used, I think, for kick and snare and probably the occasional bit of guitar recording. But the majority of the record was recorded through a Trident A series console, and it was recorded. I think we were actually. I don't think it wasn't 48 track. It was recorded 24 track, because I don't think we had an interlock system then, so we wouldn't have had 48 tracks. It might have been, but I think it was 24 track, with a Studer A80 tape machine, and the mics would have been mostly. I mean, I don't know to what degree you're interested in this, because this is very technical.
I've done some recording. I have a little bit of a knowledge, but obviously nothing like to the extent that you do.
At that time we were recording. We used a lot of condenser mics on drums, more than I would use now.
Nowadays you basically don't really use them.
No,
at least not for close miking.
Right, for close miking, most of the time using dynamics. Most people choose condenser mics for overheads and stuff like that, and cymbals, but not for apart from the odd sort of 47, maybe on a kick drum or something. But at that time we were using 87s and 67s on toms.
Really?
Yeah, and they got.
Oh my God!
Too. the number of like really what would be regarded as priceless mics that had drumstick. You're always pressing out the windscreens on them to fix all the drumstick hits. So yeah, it would have been 87s and 67s on toms a lot of the time, maybe a D20 on the kick, or a D12, which was like the precursor to the D12, and which is now considered an old mic. The D112 is the kind of current version of that, which is an AKG mic. AKG 414s, some Bayers and things like that, and Neumann, KM84s on cymbals on ride and hi-hat.
Wow, that had to be the most expensive drum set miking on the planet, probably.
I think maybe not so much in North America, but in England, that's most of the time. My experience was that everybody was using a lot of condenser mics on drum kits and stuff. It was only in the States that I started to use like a 57 and in North America, I started to use a 57 on the snare. I don't think I'd ever used one on a snare before I came to North America. Almost nobody did in England. A lot of people would use like a KM84 or something like that as a snare mic. Anyway, so that record was done in the fall, and then they went to Trident in England to mix it, which Terry did. Then after that, we got a brand new console in at Morin Heights, the SSL, the first one. Pretty much, it was actually the first one in North America, I think. It was the one that was shown at the AES when they first showed the E-Series SSL, and which for about 4 years nobody knew what it was, and they were very suspicious of it, and then it became the most successful recording console ever, probably.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the beginning of a certain kind of standardization of the recording business. Most major studios having an SSL, and most major studios having a pair of Yamaha NS10s sitting on top of the console. That was the kind of the standardization that started to happen in recording, and which meant that it was much easier for people to move around, because you always knew when you walked into a room, eight out of 10 rooms would have that.
Yeah.
Of the better rooms anyway. So everybody, it was much easier to move around and be comfortably moved from one studio to another. I mean, that wouldn't be the reason that people would become independent, but it certainly facilitated being able to move around comfortably.
Mm-hmm. Now, were those early albums that you did, were they all 2-inch tape, or did you start using a digital storage medium?
No, 2-inch tape. All the multi-tracking is 2-inch. Moving Pictures was 2-inch 48 tracks, so that means you're locking two 2-inch machines together electronically, which steals the track from each machine to synchronize them. So you end up 46 usable tracks. But because it's and the interlocks were at that time were pretty slow. Well, essentially they still are, because they're not. But at that time they were very early, and sometimes it would take 10 seconds or even more sometimes for the machines to lock into sync. So you had to pre-roll long enough before the start of the song so that to allow the machines to lock in time. I mean, technically they were supposed to be able to lock in about 2 seconds, but invariably that wasn't the case. And so sometimes you'd have to, have this sort of significant pre-roll to make sure that everything was locked together by the time you started either mixing or recording. So most of the time you'd record all the basic tracks, the sort of drums, bass, and basic track guitars on one machine. Then you'd make a rough mix of that, or a reduced mix of that, onto your second machine. And that would give you'd maybe have 6 tracks with the drums and the bass and the guitars, and then you'd have another 16 or 17 tracks to play with on the second machine, where you could layer up vocals and do all the more incidental overdubs and solos and things like that. So then you would, when you mixed it, you'd lock the 2 machines together and use the first generation copy of drums and guitars and bass from the original machine, and then all the additional overdubs would be played back from the second machine.
So even in those days, it was still fairly common to bounce tracks down to get more tracks, essentially.
Yeah.
Okay.
When I was doing, actually, that was an interesting thing, that when they came to the studio to do Permanent Waves and Moving Pictures, well, for Permanent Waves initially, I think they liked the studio's it was an impressive place, sort of visually, and from a point of view, the equipment was really good. The kind of projects that had been coming through were really good, and we got a few techniques that had, that were not necessarily common, that I think Nick had essentially picked up from Roy Thomas Baker, because Nick Lagona had worked quite a bit with Roy Thomas Baker at Morin Heights, and he'd done stuff with Nazareth, and mainly from Roy, the idea of multi-tracking things to a high degree was very common. Particularly, obviously, in the case of Queen. Queen didn't work, but that kind of approach of doing, I mean, in the case of Queen, I think every single vocal track was tracked 7 times. I think, so it was 7 tracks of lead vocals, 7 tracks of harmony, 7 tracks of every single part.
Oh my God! And in the early '70s, that was just insane.
So that was something that Roy Baker, in his sort of typically over the top kind of approach to recording, had just sort of settled on. And then Nick worked with him, and then they'd sort of discovered that recording kind of guitars, triple tracking guitars, was a really good effect. In the sense of it gave you a powerful sound, and it was more smooth and with less kind of tuning issues than if you double tracked it. And so we used that technique because the guys in Rush hadn't come across that, and they were interested in it. So we used that technique on Permanent Waves and Moving Pictures, where every main guitar part was tracked 3 times. But in the case of Alex, it meant 6, because we have a stereo spread of guitars on the left and guitars on the right to give you a big wide, big fat sound. And in order to not have and you put them extreme left and right, so it leaves a hole in the middle for the vocals and the drums to come through. So, obviously, when you put things extreme left and right, there's still a certain amount of spillover just in the room you're listening in. But basically, there would be 3 guitars on the left, 3 guitars on the right playing the identical thing, which gave the guitar sound a pretty big and fat sound, which I think actually was very beneficial at that time. But after Moving Pictures, I think probably because Alex was bored with it at that point, because there's a certain part of doing that is actually a little bit boring. You record a great guitar track, and then you double it, and then you double and do another track, and then you go on the other side of the stereo and you do the same thing again. So there's a lot of repetitive stuff. So it gives you a good sound, but it maybe takes away from the expression in the playing. We didn't do that with guitar solos. Wouldn't have. I mean, not that you couldn't do that, but guitar solos, by their very spontaneity, aren't the kind of things that lend themselves to that. But sort of basic power guitar stuff, it works very well. But the downside of it is you get maybe a bit less expression in the performance, because it becomes kind of a little bit sterilized by the layering of it. But you gain something sonically, big, fat, smooth, powerful sound. And I think it stands up today. The guitar sounds on Moving Pictures particularly, and on Permanent Waves, really do stand up and they're not as heavily overdriven as often people use now. But yet they still sound big. So it worked really well. I mean, Moving Pictures is, to this day, one of the records that I feel most proud of. It's just one of those things that it happens at various times. If you basically do this long enough, periodically you'll come across projects that it just magically all comes together, and it's extraordinary. And that, despite the fact that doing Moving Pictures, we had extraordinary technical difficulties, because everything was new. There was a new console that had problems with its automation. We had an interlock system that was less than ideal, because they were still in the early days the interlocking was sometimes not very efficient, and you'd have to wait 20 seconds from just playing before it's all locked together, which really slows the session down. And also we had a terrible batch of Ampex tape, which we were using a formula of tape called Ampex 456 at that time. And there was one batch that went out across the whole of North America that, after you'd been using it for about a month, or maybe even less, started to deteriorate. So by the time we were mixing during Moving Pictures, the oxide was falling off the tape, and it kind of gums up the heads on the tape machine. So after 2 passes, you'd have to clean the heads again, and they'd be black with oxide, and the high end would go off the tape. So we were constantly battling. There was 1 or 2 reels of it. It wasn't true of every reel, but I think on Vital Signs was one where we keep going, what happened? The tambourine's gone. Where's the tambourine? Top end's gone off the tambourine. So turn around and there's all black oxide on the tape, on the heads of the machine. And so we would start to be worried that we weren't going to get the mix finished before the tape started to disintegrate. that subsequently became notorious. There was quite a few records that went through that at that time.
So are those tapes now essentially gone and fully deteriorated, or do they
No,
still exist?
they would have been transferred into digital format at this point. These days, in order to do that, when you have tapes that are that old, I think any tape that's over about 10 or 15 years old, and these ones would have probably been 20 years old at the time, they usually bake them. They put just a sort of like, I'm not sure what kind of temperature they do it at, maybe a couple of 200 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that. I'm not sure what the baking temperature is that they use. Or it might not be as much as that, because I know some people do it by just sticking it on top of a radiator. But anyway, you need to heat the tape up so that then you get one or two chances to pass it over a tape machine without doing significant damage. But then from the moment you've ever baked a tape, I think you pretty much always have to bake it before you play it. So you basically get one or two chances. You bake the tape, it dries it out, makes the kind of glue that holds the oxide on sort of a little bit more tight, and then you can copy it into digital format, and then essentially from that moment onwards you pretty much kiss goodbye to the tape. I'm sure that the 2-inch tapes of moving pictures and permanent waves probably still exist, but it's quite possible that if you tried to unravel them, that they might just be stuck like a reel of Scotch tape. Oxide will just pull off it as you open it, so that's where things stand with that. So those tapes would have been transferred, though. They were transferred to digital format.
Now in 2002, you returned to work on Vapor Trails with Rush. What was it like working with the band again after nearly 20 years, especially in their current situation at that time?
Well, I did a couple of projects between, because after live albums, after Permanent Waves, Moving Pictures, and Signals, and Exit Stage Left, which I did whilst I was at Morin Heights.
Did you do? Was it Grace Under Pressure?
No, that one was done. That was done at Morin Heights, but it was done by Peter Henderson, who used to work with Supertramp.
Okay.
I was around at the time. I did some programming, I think, for Getty on the Oberheim or on a PPG, I think, on that record, because I was interested in synth programming at the time. But I was around and about at the studio, but Peter Henderson was producing it and with them, and he was an engineer himself, and he just did it. So subsequent to that, I did Different Stages, which was a massive kind of recording project that was recorded on ADAT machines, actually, live off the console. But they'd recorded so many shows that there was a massive amount of recording to sift through. And we did that. I mixed that for them, which also included remixing an old Hammersmith Odeon concert from 1978, which was amazing. So we had the kind of modern recording all done digitally, and then one 2-inch tape with from 20 years previous, which was actually fun to work on. And then that kept me, aside from being friends with them and friends with Neil, that kept me kind of in the loop with Rush for a number of years in between. Mm-hmm. And so when after Neil's tragedy with his family, loss of his family, he didn't actually pick up a set of drumsticks, I think, for 18 months. And at the time, probably didn't necessarily think he was going to play drums again. I thought he might actually just write or something like that. He was very much riding his motorcycle across North America and trying to just keep his life together, really. And there was a doubt that, Rush would ever do anything again. But then spontaneously, Neil just decided he got a hankering to play some drums. And my wife was managing Morin Heights Studio at the time, and Neil called up and said, "Can we arrange for him to do drums, to set up his drum kit in the video shooting stage, which is a great place to set a drum kit up." And we had a pseudonym, so nobody knew who it was, and I think even the office weren't informed, because he didn't want people to think that he was going to be playing again, so everybody's hopes would get up, and he wanted to see what it felt like. So he basically booked in about a week at Morin Heights Studio just to play drums, just to be in a big room with a big drum kit and make a lot of noise and see what it felt like, and he enjoyed himself. just getting back into the physicality of playing, and so then slowly and surely they started to sort of talk about the possibility of doing a bit of recording, and it went so. But by the time they got back into the studio, I think it had been about 5 years since the previous recording sessions. In the meantime, Geddy and Alex had done solo albums, and Neil had done, which I did with him actually, the Buddy Rich tribute record, which was very much a side project, didn't have any relation to the kind of music that he makes, in the rock world. But in Geddy and Alex's case, they did their own solo projects, which were essentially sort of their own individualist versions of the kinds of things that they do when they're working with Rush. So what that meant is when they came back together, aside from the fact they are really great friends, and there was a lot of deference to each other, there was a certain, it was an unusual situation to walk into to record them. I think they asked me to do it mainly partly because of my experience and what I was doing. I'd been working on some substantial stuff, rock stuff in the US with Marilyn Manson, and I think at that time I'd done the Hole record with Courtney Love. I'd done Manson record, or at least done the drum tracking on that, and Suicidal Tendencies and Alice Cooper. I'd done quite a lot of work, and was keeping very current. And I think the combination of those things, the fact that I was part of the family, meant that they felt comfortable about getting back in the studio and me being behind the console. At the same time, it was emotionally kind of not difficult, but there were difficult might be a word to use. Neil hadn't played for so long, and it takes a lot when you play at the level that he does. He has to, as he said, I have to build up the calluses on my hand. But I think but also, he'd not long previously gone through an experimental point where he changed from playing from match grip to traditional grip in his drum style, which is very, very different and quite as intensely powerful. It's got a nice fluidity to it to use traditional grip. But he was renowned for his power, which is very much, to a large extent, really does come from match grip playing, where you hold both sticks the same way in a sort of fist grip, and the power comes from your shoulders and your biceps perhaps more than. And obviously, there's a lot of technique whichever way you play drums. But the traditional grip is the sideways holding of the left hand, and it's a very different approach to the way you play. So the combination of those things, and that he hadn't played for very long, meant that he wasn't in the same kind of space as a drummer when I walked in on the session. And they'd been recording demos for about 5 months prior to me getting there. So we opted to carry on recording in the same manner because everybody was comfortable. They liked the studio. I liked the studio too. It was a very nice, comfortable place to record. It was convenient for them, and it was intimate. There was no other projects going on at the studio, so it was just them.
So did you record that in Toronto then?
Yes, it was a Reaction, I think, was the name of the studio, if I remember. But the studio itself wasn't really a great drum room. So the decision was, well, what can we do? But we wanted to keep the kind of family atmosphere going and not suddenly up. It was an option to pick up and move. But so what I decided to do is we just tore out the almost all of the dampening in the studio and drywalled the whole room essentially to make it into one big drum booth, which worked quite well. It changed it from being a very dead recording space to quite live. So essentially, and it also meant that we could just maintain our family atmosphere all in the same place without any other strangers around, and so the dynamics between the guys were comfortable and everything. But the other thing that was different about that record is that I worked with all of them individually, which was it was the first record they did where it was entirely done on computer. The value of that being that all the demos that they'd experimented with kind of random ideas that sometimes had inspiration in them that was very creative, were already there. And because it's done on computer, usually they'd have played to a click track or something. So all these guide tracks, multi-tracked guide tracks, would be down. So the song structure was in really good shape. And the tempos are all set, It was very easy to play over it, which was a technique they'd been using for some time, but not necessarily on a computer. But they'd often done where they'd done pre-demoed their songs with click tracks, and then Neil would be able to go and play a take beginning to end and then spin back and do another take and then edit between takes. That was the approach we were using, so we maintained working on computer. What it also meant was that because I got guide vocals, guide guitars, or some good guitars, and guide bass and everything on a very locked bed track, Neil and I could just work by ourselves, and he could just work on ideas and get up to speed and really get the intensity in his playing that he needed to get to because of who he is and what he's known for and what he was trying to achieve. And so between him and I, we'd work together for a few hours during the day, and then at the end of the evening, or about sort of 7 or 8 o'clock at night, Geddy and Alex would be invited to come, and they could critique and choose if we thought we had a drum track, we'd usually have like 3 or 4 takes that we considered to be viable drum tracks, and then they could come and have some input and decide whether they thought they were good or we needed to do something else. So that meant that I worked with Neil by himself, and the deal was they had to bring something from their extensive wine cellars, so whilst they came and listened and critiqued what we'd been doing during the day. So it worked like that, and I worked with each person separately, which was, I think, partly out of deference to everybody as individuals. Geddy and Alex wanted to give Neil some space, and just to be able to let him find his own kind of, comfort with where it needed to be. And both Geddy and Alex had done solo albums, so we're used to sort of just basically being able to do anything they felt like doing on their own project. And I think to some degree wanted to still have a bit of that quality in the way they worked. At the same time, they knew that at a certain point they all had to agree on where they were going, what they were doing. And so that's where, even though there was never any real difficulty in the sense of people arguing, it was more of a difficulty in the sense that everybody wanted everybody else to be happy. So it was a little, the difference in vision of what was the dominant force of the record sometimes was, because I know Alex was really very interested in very aggressive guitar sounds at the time and stuff like that. His favorite stuff, I think, was very much Nine Inch Nails sort of direction, which has an intensity and a power that can be very good, but at the same time, how that blends in with what Rush is all about, whereas Geddy was, I think, more interested in the melodies and what he was doing vocally. So right there, you have a natural battle. It's not a battle about who's right or wrong. It's a battle about, okay, well, how do we make these things work together? This kind of slightly different visions of what. And I think because we got into a very difficult time mixing that record, and I think that ultimately that's where that came from. Initially, when we were mixing, it was going great, and I think I started mixing the record in sort of early December, and after a couple of weeks, we mixed about 5 or 6 songs, and everybody was going home for Christmas going, wow, it's going great, sounds great. And then when I got back home, we took a break. I didn't listen to anything away for Christmas. We'd been working for 6 months on the record, and then after Christmas, it was like, no, it doesn't. It's not right. It sounds it sounds all too compressed. It doesn't sound right. So suddenly it was like, oh, okay. So we went through. I spent another 2 or 3 weeks mixing with them, still with not real. It was a struggle, and so then it was decided that we'd get somebody else to mix it. So I stepped out of the process, and Dave Leonard came in and mixed with them, and so at the end of the day, I think by the time the record was finished, I think it was very kind of torturous, and I think that everybody just wanted to get it over with. And so it was, when it finally came out, it was a very powerful record with a lot of emotion, and I think some great writing on it, and great sort of song structures and interesting and creative stuff. But it suffered. The mixing and mastering was a problem, and I think it was a thorn in the band's side for a long time, and they knew that they needed to revisit it, or was intended to, but I think it's taken as long as it has for them to finally it has been remixed, the entire thing, which is wonderful. And Dave Bottrell was mixing it in Toronto, and I haven't heard it, but I've spent some time talking with him, and sounds like he's done a fantastic job. And I think everybody's going to have a lot of fun listening to some, a remixed version of that album, because it's an important record from a point of view of where Rush, it was that bridge from early Rush to almost the breakup of the band. And then, well, at the time when they made the record, they didn't think that they would actually tour. Alex and Geddy didn't think that Neil would want to tour. And I sort of begged to differ, because I thought that, particularly Neil had remarried, and I knew that, I thought, you can't be who you are and not want the most important person in your life at the time to not know who you are and see, what you do. And aside from the fact that I'm part of him, obviously, just as much as he sometimes says he hates touring, I think he likes it up until the first few shows, and once the first few really great shows have gone down, then it becomes a job. But he's very motivated, I think, to do a really great show at the beginning. I think, Neil's very much a driven person that likes to. He's a perfectionist, but once he's achieved that, then he doesn't really want to do it every night again and again and again. So he has a love-hate relationship with touring. So anyway, so I helped them get through making Vapor Trails, and I've thought about that record a lot, all the things I could have done different, and why was it difficult, and why, where it got to where it's at. But at the end of the day, they ended up with a record. They went out and toured, and then rebuilt their sort of band spirit, and have gone on to do some great stuff. So all things said and done, I'm still glad to have been asked to be involved in that, and it was a very dramatic time, So.
Okay, so now I'd like to just go back, and we'll just start looking at some of the other bands and projects you've done over the years. God, that's that was like an hour's worth of Rush. And the funny thing, we're only maybe a quarter through the questions I had planned.
You're going to have to do some serious editing, but at least this will be on record. I'm recording it as well, so if ever I want to write a book, I can just write all this down.
That'd be fantastic. You should.
Well, sometimes I think about it because of just having lived through, just the privilege of having been in the recording business for 40 years, from the early 70s to current day, which is a massively different recording environment with different techniques, different technology, and a different whole kind of cultural environment the recording process is. So it is. I think it's interesting. At the very least, I think it might be interesting for my daughter, so she has a record of what crazy stuff her father went through, and in the process, it might be interesting for other people. I don't know. I don't have any pretensions about writing particularly, except that it's just an interesting journey, and some people love this stuff. They want to know everything about how records are made, and it affects the way they do things now. And so people need to write these things down, and I guess I'm one of those people, so I probably should.
Well, here's your impetus to get started, I say. Okay, so I guess we'll sort of jump back to the early 80s where we left off with Rush. And we kind of mentioned April Wine, but what was it like working with producer-engineer Mike Stone to do Power Play?
Mike Stone was the funniest music engineer-producer I've ever met. He was completely outrageous in the way he handled people. He'd be quite, sometimes almost abusive in his sort of humor with people, but always had a comeback line. If it went down badly, anything that he said, he always somehow managed to reply and say something that made everybody laugh, and made the person that was the brunt of the joke laugh themselves, either at themselves or with everybody at the absurdity. And he was really good at that, which is very valuable, because sometimes in the studio you need people. Part of the job is to manage intense, egos, and sort of sometimes you're dealing with very powerful musicians that their ego is what drives them. In a positive way. I don't mean just negatively. It's the amount of energy that people put into being great musicians and stuff, or performers and stage performers, is very sort of intense, and so a lot of the characters you come across have real psychological drama. They're either very extrovert and forthright and outspoken, or sometimes very introvert, and you're always balancing these personalities. You're trying to help them get the best out of themselves, and that often means a lot of like juggling just to make everybody comfortable and dissipate the tension if there's disagreement in the room. Somebody's just played the hardest they could possibly played a performance that's difficult and really hard, and then everybody wants to go, no, that's rubbish, got to do it again, without destroying somebody's confidence or just making them mad. You don't get, there's a constant battle in recording where you're doing that. You need to encourage people and make them feel completely relaxed, and sometimes so he was a real character in that sense. He was a master of dealing with crazy people, and he drank a lot, which was unfortunate. Actually, it also contributed to his humor, but he was an alcoholic, which subsequently, I think, because he died a few years back, about 4 or 5 years ago, I think, and probably from liver damage, because there was enormous amounts of vodka and orange juice drunk during some of those sessions. But he was a very functional alcoholic in as much as he was funny and not an obnoxious alcoholic. But it was definitely an issue. I mean, just you only had to see how many cases of vodka would go through. It's probably about a case a week.
Oh my God.
That's unreal. Yeah, and but he was a wonderful person. I really liked Mike, and I ended up doing I spent almost a year or 18 months with him. I did two April Wine albums with him. The first one I did, then not which at that time we were doing really long albums, and he worked on long albums. So I think the first one I did was probably 3 or 4 months long, and then there was a short break during which time I'm thinking that maybe Rush came into the studio. I'm not sure. Then that I wasn't working on, but then he came back with Asia. So I did Asia's Alpha album with him, which was a 5-month project. And then immediately after that, we did another April Wine album. And the April Wine albums would have been, I guess, 18 months apart. So basically 6 months of that break I was doing, I probably did other things for about a year, but I did another 5 months with Mike in between with Asia. So yeah, he was a great guy, amazing guy, very funny, and a powerful personality to be around. And it's a shame. We miss him in the music business, I think.
Yeah. And then what was it like working on their follow-up, Animal Grace? Because supposedly by this point, April Wine had all but disintegrated.
Animal Grace, actually the disintegration happened after that. Animal Grace we got through, if I remember. I may be mistaken, but the album where the band disintegrated was actually never happened, because they came into the studio to start an album, and there was a lot of tension. I think that what it was that the band was realizing that I think at that time Miles may have done a solo album. Miles was carrying the weight of the band from a writing point of view, and always had actually, but was very much the leader of the band. And I think because everybody started to sense that maybe they were getting to the end of the career of April Wine, everybody started to feel like they needed to step up to the plate and have some more input and write some songs and things like that. And so there's suddenly an urgency, which I think was a double-edged sword, because I think on one level Miles probably wanted them to take, sort of was saying, well, I'm the one that's doing all the work and I'm writing all the stuff and nobody else is doing it. And apart from Brian, who'd written, I think, Sign of the Gypsy Queen, I think, off of one of the records. Brian had done like one song, I think, on every album for the last two or three albums. So suddenly everybody was coming in with material, and then it was, I think Miles was uncomfortable with that, because it was like now he's got to battle, after years of writing the material, and now he's going to have to battle to get some of his material on when other people want theirs. And some of the other material was good too, so it wasn't like a simple question of what ended up happening. Was this was the album after Animal Grace. They just basically, it just all blew up in the studio before they even really got started. and Miles decided he just said, I quit. So the 2 months of studio time that was booked suddenly was no longer there. I think I'm accurate, and that's the way I remember it. It's a long time ago, but essentially, anytime you're around the breakup of a band, it's kind of dramatic. This happened in the studio, so it was very sudden. One day they were booked for 2 months, and then suddenly it's like, no, we're not going. We're breaking up. So that was it's a bit strange. But that was the album after. Well, the album that never actually happened.
So in 1986, you worked on Kim Mitchell's album, Shaken Like a Human Being. How was it working with Kim?
Great, actually. He's a fantastic musician, great guitar player. Really great musician, all-round musician. His, knowledge of arranging and instrument, just performance and everything. He was a great guy to work with. He knew what he wanted. It was a great record. I really enjoyed it. And not much more can be said, really. The only interesting thing on that record was, one interesting thing on the record was that Patio Lanterns was a song that he really was unsure about. He didn't, and he wanted to throw it off the record because it was he was probably a little self-conscious that it was maybe a bit too cute. But I was just recording it and mixing it, and I was like, no, this is good. You should do this. Is a good song. It's like, it's cute, but it's got an edge to it. It's got a point. There's a point of view in it that people can relate to. I didn't see it as being something that you shouldn't put on the record. And so reluctantly, he sort of went, oh, okay, well, all right. Not that it was my call, but I just maybe helped allay his doubts. And subsequently, he probably hates me for it because he's probably played it so many times or asked that so many times that he probably hates it with a passion at this point. However, on the flip side, there was some really powerful, big rock songs like That's the Hold and things like that on that record, which I think, balance out the cuteness of Patio Lanterns. And so anyway, it was a good record to do, and he's a great guy and great musician. And I don't know what he's done. I heard that he'd done a record relatively recently.
Yeah, about 5 years ago or so.
Oh, it's as long ago as that, is it? Oh, okay.
Actually quite good. Like he's still writing, recording great music.
Well, he's a formidable musician. I mean, I don't know if he's playing as much as he used to, which but he was a really great guitar player, and a good vocalist too. He's got his. There's no reason why he couldn't just be making great records.
Now, was Pi Dubois the lyricist? Was he
Yes.
in the studio during this? Okay, he was.
Yeah. I think he dropped by. Yeah, because I met him, and that's the only time I would have met him, I think. With the possible exception of at some awards ceremony in Toronto, perhaps. But he's the man behind the lyrics. He's a great poet, basically.
Yeah, what I understood, I don't know if it was just in Max Webster or later, but I know he used to supposedly hang around the sessions and sort of write in studio, but that I assume didn't happen when you guys did Shaken Like a Human Being, eh?
No, he may have been around for a few days. He was not there all the time, for sure.
Okay.
It's very possible that he came and at a certain point and spent a bit of time, but I can't remember that in detail.
Okay, fair enough. And then a couple years later, you got hooked up with Jimbo Barton and Peter Collins to do Operation Mindcrime. How'd you meet up with those guys?
Well, I've not actually met Jim. Or actually, that's not true. I didn't meet him at a gig once. Basically, the guys in Rush had been working with Peter Collins after parting company with Terry, and Jim was working for Peter essentially, or doing most of Peter's projects at that time. So they got to work with Jim then, and then Jim Barton and his wife were having a baby, and so he wasn't available to do all of Operation Mindcrime. So Geddy had suggested to Peter Collins that he work with me, and that's how I came to work on it. So Jim had recorded the drum tracks, I think drums and bass. I think he'd recorded. in Philadelphia, and so Peter came with the band to Morin Heights, and I did all of the rest, all of the rest of the recording,
Oh,
all the
okay.
guitars, all the vocals, and then rough mixed it and handed it off, and then Jim went and mixed it. I think somewhere else in Lake Geneva, I think in Wisconsin. I think he mixed it.
Okay, so you just answered about 7 of my questions, so that's great. Trying to jump ahead. So the same thing with Empire. From what I understand, you started working on it in Vancouver, and then Jimbo just took over after a few days.
No, that was what happened there. Was they basically Peter was still working with Jim. They did one song. I don't know what it was for. Whether it's for a movie. The song Empire was done separately. Mm-hmm. Jim was not available, and so they had me fly it. We did it in Seattle. I went to Seattle and to a pretty funky studio actually, and we recorded Empire in its entirety. And then after that, at that time they'd already arranged to do the next album with Jim, even though it went really well with me. Not that it's a big issue, because that's the way it is in this business. Sometimes you do with one person, and everybody has their strengths. So, but the recording of Empire went really well, and so I recorded that whole track, and then Jim mixed it, and then with the addition of all the other songs on it, that became the Empire album.
So around the time of Empire in the late 80s, you leave the Montreal area and you started working on records elsewhere. What was the catalyst for that move?
Well, essentially, I'd been at Morin Heights for a long time, and also to have some success, like more international success, you had to be ready to go where the work was. As great as Morin Heights Studio was, also the whole environment of being recording, producing was very much at that point an independent thing. You didn't, unless you owned the studio yourself, there was no value in being associated with one studio in particular. So I had to, in order for me to sort of further my career, I needed to just be ready to go anywhere. And basically the opportunities started to come that I would be able to go and work in different places. So there was a certain kind of isolation working in Morin Heights, because it was such a beautiful place to live, and especially at that time when you work for such long hours and for every day of the week, then as soon as you've got time off, you don't want to go to New York and do a recording session. You just want to hang out at the lake.
Yeah.
So for a large amount of time, I mean, I started at Morin Heights in 1978, and I think it was around the time my daughter was born, so I think it was 9 years later that I left. So I'd been in one place for 9 years, and out of that, I'd worked on some great records, but now I needed to be ready to move. So, because otherwise I would have, well, it just wasn't productive really, just to keep staying in the same place.
Yeah.
So, so then I started to work in Los Angeles a lot. Peter Collins was a catalyst to moving, because he liked working with me. I did 3 or 4 albums with him. I did a band called Soraya. Aside from Queensryche, I did Alice Cooper's Hey Stupid album with him, which was fun with all the guest performers. And then I did Suicidal Tendencies with him, who I subsequently then went on to do. I've done about 6 albums with them, and Infectious Grooves, and count Mike Muir, the leader of the band, as a good friend. And so I still do work with them, even at this point. And then I had management in Los Angeles. My manager, Sandy Robertson, out of LA, who keeps me plugged in to interesting projects. And subsequently, I got to do the whole record with Michael Beinhorn, who I also did Ozzy with. I did an album with Ozzy, and then after doing Ozzy, Geezer Butler asked me to produce his solo album with him, so I did subsequently another one of those. So I did 2 solo albums with Geezer Butler from Black Sabbath. So that kind of meant that I was working a lot in Los Angeles and traveling. I did albums in Australia with a band called The Poor, which was very much an AC/DC sort of inspired, very roots rock record, with the drummer of whom was interesting, the nephew of he was a Young, and the nephew of Malcolm and Angus Young. And but the band itself was, the driving force behind the band was a great singer and guitarist and but they had very much a AC/DC kind of style. And that record was really good and nearly broke, but it just as it was starting to break in the US, Smells Like Teen Spirit kicked into gear, and suddenly classic rock was no longer of any value.
Yeah.
It was Seattle grunge for the next 5 years or 10 years or whatever. So I traveled a lot then. I probably spent, if I added all the time I spent in Los Angeles, it would add up to like 3 or 4 years of solid time of making records in Los Angeles, even though that was spread out over maybe a 15 to 20 year period. So.
Yeah. It's funny you bring up Ozzy. I interviewed Michael Wagner a couple weeks ago, and he did the first version of Osmosis before the label wanted the album remixed and everything to sound like Soundgarden. When you got a hold of it, did you redo the album from scratch, or did you take a lot of the stuff he'd done and bring it further?
No, it was done completely from scratch.
Okay.
Yeah. Michael Beinhorn was very much was sort of the flavor of the moment, because he'd done the Super Unknown album, and I think that was the driving force. I think, I love Michael Wagner's work. He's a fantastic engineer producer, but the style that he's known for is very much a kind of classic rock style. I mean, the album he did with No More Tears is a great record, but I think stylistically it's very polished, and I think one of the things about the Seattle scene was that it sort of like managed to bring in, a bit more of an earthy tonality that was a little bit, maybe a little bit less high tech, and a certain kind of, for want of a better word, maybe an honesty in the kind of recording process. That was what was the appeal of the kind of grunge scene, which is something that we go through time and time again, because the English punk scene was a reaction to all the fussiness and the pretentiousness and the polish and yet we now go back to it again because people like experimentalism, and the progressive rock was the most experimental music on the planet. And yes, pretentious, and yes, full of itself, and sometimes very fussy, but sometimes really extraordinary, but then sometimes lacking in the sort of visceral qualities that rock and roll is all about, like just getting out a certain amount of aggression, or just, there's a certain catharsis in power rock, where you'll get people that are the most mild-mannered people off stage. On stage are demons, and there's something that in all of us about that you need an opportunity to let rip, and that's the appeal of those qualities in rock music, and we have had waves of that, and interspersed with experimentalism and intellectual stuff and things like that, and technology, because technology also makes its presence felt with new sounds and new possibilities, and so everybody's always sort of going through these different cycles, and so in this case with Ozzy's record, I'm sure the record companies just sort of saw the writing on the wall and said, okay, Ozzy is associated with sort of classic rock, school classic rock. And however good a recording and production that Michael may have done, Michael Wagner, it would probably be identified with the earlier, with like No More Tears or something. And so the record company, in their infinite wisdom, decided that they needed it to be Ozzy to sound like he came from Seattle. So anyway, subsequently, Michael Beinhorn was brought in to produce it, and some of the songs would have been kept, some of them would have been completely new. I know that a number of songs were completely new because I think Michael was around at the demo sessions where, like with, because Jim Vallance, they had a lot of other writers involved, I think. Jim Vallance wrote a couple of songs on it, and I think Geezer wrote all of the lyrics, Geezer Butler.
Oh, okay.
But that was the first time Geezer had played with Ozzy, I think, for a long time. So Geezer being a founder of Black Sabbath, so that there was a certain kind of change there, and I was asked to do that, and I recorded it in Paris, the bed tracks in Paris, and then we recorded the rest of it in New York.
And there's a rumor that Zakk Wylde only played certain guitar parts on Osmosis. Was he involved with the whole thing, all the guitar recording?
He did the whole thing.
Okay.
Zakk did the whole thing. Yeah. No, there's no question. Zakk did every guitar on that record. We did all the bed tracks, the drum tracks, and bass were all done in Paris, and then we recut some songs whilst we were in Paris, and then decided to recut another couple of songs, which after we'd already started overdubbing and mixing in New York. So we did one or two songs we did the tracks for at Bearsville, so which were like, because we didn't want to go back to Paris to do the same thing, so we went to but I can't remember which songs those were, but there was certainly one, if not two songs that were recut in Bearsville, mainly just because of just some idiosyncrasies of what Michael was looking for in the performance or something like that. And Michael Beinhorn, we're talking about now, who's producing, is quite the extremist in terms of the way he likes to do things. I remember my first time I met him in Paris, when we walked into the studio, and it was in an old theatre, and he'd brought in a PA to feed the drums in the room out through a PA to get a bit more room resonance and power coming out of the drum kit, which was something I'd done before. You know, sometimes people would set up a modest sized set of speakers up with the kick drum and the snare and maybe the toms pumped out into the room, just to get the room a little bit more like a live show, gives you a bit more sort of gets the room fired up a bit more. Except in Michael's case, he'd ordered in a quadraphonic PA from Britannia Sound and Lighting from England that was enough to do a small festival. so it was like, oh my God, you know. And it was like a small cinema, or medium-sized cinema that was the studio. And on what was originally the stage, proscenium stage of where the cinema was, or the theatre, he got, there was a bunch of drums lined up, and there was a huge array of snare drums. And one of the first things he said when he walked into the room, he was like, okay, looks at the snare drums like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 14 snare drums. No, we need some more. There were only 14 snare drums, and I worked with him on a couple of projects. Well, with him on Ozzy, and then I did Hole with him, and his whole sort of modus operandi was always extremism to try, you know, and to the point of absurdity sometimes. You know, we tried on Hole. We had every ride cymbal that they had at the Guitar Center.
Oh my God!
Brought over so that we could test them, and then we used the ride cymbal that Paddy Schemmel came with when she... So that was always entertaining. But sometimes it would take weeks, you know, like we spent 2 weeks just trying to get a drum sound. In fact, actually not trying to get a drum sound. We spent 2 weeks getting 6 different drum sounds, and the one we used was the last one, not because it was better, but because I think we were all bored with getting drum sounds at that point. We didn't record anything with the other drum sounds. We'd spend a day getting a drum sound, a new drum kit, put drum heads on, try different mics, and set it all up and go, okay, yeah, that's good. Okay, let's try another one now. And it was all I could do to get Michael to actually record some reference snare drums onto a DAT tape, because it was like, no, we don't need to do that. Let's try another drum sound. So we did 6 different drum sounds with different kits, different parts of the room, and different miking. And when we finally came to record, it was like, okay, so I guess we should do some recording now. So it was okay. So I said to him, which drum kit, which one shall we use then? Because we've got 6 really good drum sounds here. Which approach do you want to take? And he said, well, this one seems pretty good, what we've got right set now. And I said, yeah, well, let's use that one. So it was like I was stunned. My initiation into over-the-top, you know, California-style record production, you know, which is not that I'd already worked with him and knew that he liked to indulge in massive quantities of like either guitars or amplifiers or, you know, different things. But that really took it to a new level for me of like spending 2 weeks in the studio. We got 5 drum sounds that were never used for anything, and I still don't to this day quite understand what the reason for doing that was. But anyway, he's made some important records, and eccentricity has always been a part of what we do. So for some people, so you know, I guess that's.
So now I'd like to take some time and sort of talk about your approach to mixing and gear and all the sort of nitty gritty stuff and recording. What are your thoughts on recording in analog versus digitally? Is there one medium you prefer, or?
Yes, digitally. And the reason for that is that the most important thing is the way you hear stuff, the way you approach it. Analog has value in as much as it limits you. If you feel like you want to be forced into a situation where you have to have continuous takes, that you can maybe edit the takes, but you're not going to be able to sit and manipulate it. If you keep it in the analog domain, obviously you can copy analog onto digital and then start chopping it up and quantizing it. And if you want to force yourself to use a certain technical approach, then it has value. And so I admire people that choose to do that. But you can do that if you do it digitally. Sonically, at this point, I would say there is virtually nothing you can do analog-wise that you can't do digital with processing. In the early transition from analog to digital, when I was doing Porcupine Tree, for instance, we simultaneously recorded analog and digital at the power station in New York, or Averton, I think it was at that time. And halfway through the album, we kept comparing the two, and the only difference between the sounds between the Studer 800 and the digital recording system we had was the tape hiss. So we decided, what's the point? Certain kinds of recording, the Seattle sound, for instance, was dominantly done with 16-track 2-inch running at 15 IPS. That's something that Michael Beinhorn always liked to do. That actually has a sound, because if you're running at 15 IPS, the slower tape speed, it cuts quite a lot of high frequencies off, it gives you a more kind of carved out, focused tonality, which is not to say it doesn't have any top end, but it's got a very distinctive quality in the top end, and the low end is very thick and fat. So that can be an interesting sound. That being said, now most people, apart from that particular era of recording, like I say, Seattle grunge sound, there was one or two studios that only had 16-track machines, and I think they did some significant recordings, and suddenly it became the trend. Oh, everybody has to record a 15 IPS on 16-track, which forces a certain quality in the sound. I think at this point, there's not much you can't do in the digital domain sonically that you can do in the analog domain. However, you have to have the vision for it, and most people, myself included, don't. I know what I want something to sound like before I record it, and I know how to achieve that for the most part, assuming it's achievable with the musician in front of you and the instruments that are in your hands. But the thing is, when you work with analog, especially for younger, newer producers that maybe have started out playing around with the computer, and as in the case of most of us, when we first start doing this job, you like to fiddle with the buttons because that's what they're there for. The buttons are the most interesting, all the knobs and the things that you can twiddle and turn. And that's half of the trip that people get into recording, they trip out on. Whereas when you come at it from a point like me, who's been doing it for 40 years, the sound is in your head first, and whatever tools you have at your disposal, you use that to achieve the sound that's already in your head. So consequently, analog or digital doesn't make a lot of difference, except that digital is way more flexible, and you can, for me, the exciting thing with digital is you can capture spontaneity and turn it into something cohesive, which is to me the ultimate in experimentation. You could capture somebody playing an acoustic guitar sitting on the porch, and they maybe get through a verse and a chorus, and the guitar's in perfect tune, and the atmosphere and the mic is great, and then suddenly a string broke, and then you put it all back together again, and you put new strings on the guitar. It doesn't sound the same. Suddenly you can't use the original take, which had a personality. But in the digital world, you can take things like that, where you go, well, we have a kind of funky recording of something with a really cool feeling about it, and then manipulate it either by cutting choruses and make them into a song, cutting verses and choruses, fixing the tuning or the performance on little things that would have been completely unacceptable in the past. However, to do that because you want to capture some particular magic, I think is a really great thing. And I mean, the ultimate of that, for instance, admittedly, it's taking one thing out of one context and using it in another, was Moby's Play album would be a great example, where he took music that had been recorded, 50 years previously, the spirituals, English spirituals that he used on that record, and turned them into a contemporary piece of recording. But the most powerful thing in that music is actually the human thing coming from those original recordings and then being manipulated. But that's the thing that gives it the emotional connection. For all of the danceability and technology involved in that album, the thing that stands out is that kind of window on the world of some recordings that happened 50 years previously. And so in a similar sense, you can do that with digital technology. You can capture raw emotion and chop it up and make sure that, if it was a fantastic tape, but in the past it might have been unusable because it maybe sped up too much. So you can tidy that up. You can manipulate things so I think that's a great use of modern technology. However, the downside is we do tend to overdo it. We need to get back to it's fantastic to hear huge vocal harmonies that are in perfect tune and perfect timing. Yes, it sounds beautiful, but it's also unreal and a little sterile. And you go, my immediate reaction to things like that of extraordinary precision, and it's true of hard rock too, like a lot of metal stuff where it's all quantized to achieve this wall of intensity. Yes, it's the first couple of times you hear that kind of thing, you go, wow, that's incredible. But then you realize, well, it is not really that much different from a machine playing it. And so after you've heard one or two albums that have those qualities, you kind of go, it starts to become less interesting.
Yeah.
And you start to go, okay, I know we can have, 64th note kick drums from beginning to the end of the song. So what? It could be a drum machine. Yes, maybe the guy can play that fast, but why? So you need to go beyond that. You need to keep those things in reserve for those moments when you want it to sound insanely intense. But then you need to have the room for expression and stuff like that in music, I think. So, I mean, different kinds of music are different in so many different ways. But making everything perfect in the computer has a big downside, because it takes you more and more steps away from the human connection. And I think you have to balance that out. I mean, a master of the reverse would be, Neil Young, who I've heard some great stories about Neil Young's recording of recent past, where he goes into the studio. His engineer producer that he works with, this story was relayed to me about him going into the studio. The engineer goes in, he plays a lot of instruments, so he'll go in the day before, set up the studio, set up the drum kit, go and sit at the drum kit, set up the headphones, play something on the drum kit, make sure everything's right, play the bass, play the guitars, sit at every space, and have it all set ready to go. And Neil will walk in and get together with the band and start playing, and they'll just play a song, that's it. Play another one, that's it. And not do any sound check, not do anything. It's all done before. And I don't know how accurate that is, but that's the story that was relayed to me, and I find it quite credible. And it's an interesting approach to sort of capturing human spontaneity. And sure, you can, if you play a song 10 times, you can perfect it, but maybe it will become more safe and more tidy and have less of that kind of tension that you get from a spontaneous performance. And so we're always battling with those things. So but it's a fun business like that, because you're always trying to decide, okay, do we want precision today? Do we want to use the computers to make everything sound perfect? Or are we trying to capture the raw emotion of somebody that's beating the shit out of a drum kit or whatever it is, or screaming their head off, or playing a guitar with, whatever it is that we're doing.
What are your thoughts today on common industry practices like the loudness wars or too much auto-tune?
Part of the discussion with Vapor Trails was that it suffered massively from that problem and the mastering. And I think at that time early on, people didn't really see it as the loudness wars. Everybody just thought, well, louder was always from album days, like when we used to have vinyl. There was definite limits to how loud you could make it, and the whole idea, I think, was that people liked the idea of putting your record on and it jumped out of the speakers compared to the record that was on before. But in the world of digital, because of the ability to manipulate sound to such a high level, to such a high degree, you can take it to absurd levels. Not to mention that people were using techniques that in retrospect were very misplaced, which was intentional clipping to do that, which was the case in Vapor Trails, and not something that the band were necessarily aware of, other than the sense that, oh, okay, we go to a mastering engineer, he does what he usually does, he's done a whole bunch of records that we love. In this case, it was like Howie Weinberg with Vapor Trails, who's done some spectacularly great mastering, and had an ability to get things to sound loud, but also with a lot of depth and dimension. But if you get somebody that's got out of bed on the wrong day or the wrong side and is pushing for level over musicality, then you suffer big time for it. And in this instance, I think the combination of the band being worn out with the record, relying on somebody else just to sort of go, relying on somebody you trust. At the time, there was a lot of trust in Howie, and not really questioning, does it actually need to be this loud? It was just more, and there's an absurdity about it, because obviously if you make a record and you put, say, Guns N' Roses on the CD player or on your iPod, and then you grab your record and you put it on and it sounds like minuscule volume, it's disconcerting, and you go, what's wrong with my record? I need it to sound as good as Appetite for Destruction or whatever, and so people inherently are mistaking volume for quality, or power, and it took until it reached absurd levels. The most absurd being obviously my most recent Metallica album, where everybody involved, engineers, mastering engineers who quit, who didn't want to do this because it was absurd, everybody involved regarded it as being insane and not musical and not worth doing. And for some reason or other, the guys in the band decided that they did want to do this. And it's, I guess it takes reaching an absurd level before everybody starts to calm down and go, okay, because at the bottom line is, if you put your record on and it's a lot louder, you're just going to turn it down. And if, in the case of people wearing iPods, you either have the automatic function in the computer that tries to level everything out so that one thing doesn't sound louder than another. And if you don't have that switched on, then you're constantly grabbing the volume button. It's not fun to put on a really dynamic record that's rich with a lot of depth, and then suddenly you get hit with, a wall of sound. You put a Metallica album on and it's 20 dB louder on average, which will basically just blow your ears out as soon as it comes on. So what possible value does that have for anybody? Because at the end of the day, you just have to turn it down, and then you've got the equivalent of, like 12-bit audio or something, because you've taken a full range audio or something and now turned it way down in the digital domain. And so it's a loudness wars is an absurdity that has, fortunately, I think, is on the wane. That everybody, I think, now knows what it is and what, that it's a silly thing. And but it took a lot of, unfortunate, sort of messed up records to get there. That's not to say that there's not some value in using compression techniques to make records sound punchy and powerful, because they have musical merit. Because people forget that in the quote olden days, when we didn't use compression in the same way, the amount of compression that's going on tape was substantial, really substantial. We didn't. That's part of the reason that analog sounds the way it does, and it had a profound impact on the way records sounded. I remember in the early days being very surprised. A person mentioned to me that they thought the difference between American recordings and English recordings and the sound was caused by VU meters and peak reading meters. And at the time I thought that was a really ridiculous thing to say, but subsequently thought that actually that is exactly why, because the American records were always, they always had big, fat, thick snare drums and stuff, and partly because they were very much R&B or backbeat-driven music, great rhythm sections and stuff. But a lot of great American records always had a big, fat snare drum sound, and in England, you didn't get so much of that. But in England, you'd get in the sort of progressive music stuff, you'd get really crisp and bright and detailed sounds. And Americans didn't seem to be able to record a lot of this kind of crisp, bright, high-tech stuff. And the Brits didn't seem to be able to record great, fat-sounding kind of rhythm sections. And basically, when you use VU meters, tape saturation is extraordinarily large. And crisp, bright sounds don't saturate in a nice way. They sound terrible. Whereas big, fat snare drums sound even better. So the medium itself encourages you to do those things. So consequently, to get back to the loudness wars, is that historically using analog, we always did have a lot of compression all the way along the chain, in the process. And so once we went digital, everything was kind of a little cold and didn't have that big sort of squishiness or mashing stuff together that gave stuff sort of a fatness and a size. So you had to do it in different ways. And I think now people have learned lots of different techniques of how to do that. So if you're coming from the analog world, it's naturally there. You spend a lot of time trying to get space and detail. Whereas in the digital world, you got the space and the detail. You have to use other techniques to get the thickness and the fatness. And compression is a big factor in that. And but along the way, as with everything in kind of technology and music, we all push everything to the limits. And in the case of the loudness wars, it was very detrimental. And hopefully, some records, desperately needed to be remastered. In the case of Vapor Trails, that was the case. But I think the band just wanted to, get away from it and then remix it, as well, just with hindsight and with a lot of distance, So, but anyway, that's my thinking on loudness wars. If that makes any sense to you.
Yep. Yeah. No, that's very interesting. One of the big things I've heard about sort of the digital versus analog debate is, as far as I know, and correct me on this if I'm wrong, digital, basically what you hear is what you get. Whereas with analog, if you wanted something to sound bright, you needed to brighten up the hell out of it before it hit the tape. Otherwise, it wouldn't come out sounding the way you wanted, for example.
It's not strictly like that. For instance, you always set up an analog tape machine to be as accurate as you possibly can, unless you're intentionally manipulating the biasing or choosing slow tape speeds intentionally to have a sonic effect. However, in analog, there's if you hit the tape hard, the top end will get crushed, the bottom end will get thicker. It might be muddier, but it might be good. It might so in digital, good quality digital with very high quality converters basically is exactly what you send to it. So in that sense, it's the same. If you send bright stuff to analog, it'll come back bright if the tape machine's well aligned. But there are subtle things. If you did a recording with a perfectly aligned 30 IPS tape machine and compared it to a digital machine playing back the same thing, you'd be surprised at how similar they sound. But if you make an album and you start to push things, especially in the analog world, if you use odd tape formulations or 15 IPS or play with the bias to give you a bit more distortion in the top end and kind of granularity in the sound, you will actually change this. You get a different sound coming back from what you send. What in the digital world, what it means is, the other problem is in the digital world, all of the early processing in digital was everybody was trying to idealize, like equalize, make them perfect. Like there's no phase shift in this. The specifications of this digital EQ are exactly textbook the way EQs should be. Whereas in fact, the ones who are using in the analog world are usually much more like they have personalities. Some EQs that sound fantastic have a lot of phase shift in them. Some of them, the ones that don't have phase shift in them, are the ones that sound very transparent, like digital EQs. But the ones that people love, usually the ones with a bunch of transformers in, and they've got some distortion in that's not obviously distortion, but it's like harmonic content in the sound that enhances it. But now in the digital world, we have, the more you analyze and the more you understand the inherent sort of qualities in analog gear, then the more easy it is to reproduce them. And now they do that. The first generation of emulated equalizers was okay. Usually you had a very nice pretty picture that looked like the equalizers that are your favorite, but they didn't really quite sound the same. But now we're getting ever closer, and sometimes they really do sound the same. And even if they don't, they're close enough that you don't really care, and you get on to doing other things. I mean, I think that there are really excellent emulations now of compressors and equalizers in the digital domain, which is not to say that they are always better, because there's something to be said for just having a number of boxes around that with big fat buttons on them that turn. The way you interact with them is different. There's a certain kind of romance to having an old box with big knobs on it that you turn, and it's, rather than using a mouse on a screen, that it affects the way you use them. It's true that, like, one of the biggest differences, for instance, sometimes in compressors is the way the meter responds. Because essentially when you use a compressor, you go, okay, I've got something that's very dynamic in here, I need to control the dynamics. You don't turn the knobs and go, okay, I'm going to turn this knob, and oh, I can hear that did that this did this. What you do is you go, okay, I need to kind of quieten down the loud bits. So you turn the knobs until the meter moves, and the meter moves kind of in proportion to what you're thinking you want it to do, like the and so you set things up according to the meters. Having done so, you start to sort of go, okay, yeah, that feels good. And then as you listen to it, you go, okay, maybe it sounds a bit overcompressed, so you back it off, or you go, hang on, I think I can push this a bit more. And at a certain point, you either ignore the meters, but the visual stuff, even though theoretically we're working with sound here, we should be just, you should be only turning the knobs in accordance with the way it sounds. But it's not like that. You don't do that. Otherwise, we could all have, all of the boxes we have could just be black with white numbers on, and the dials could all be the same, and we would make perfect decisions about what we were doing and it's not like that. You grab stuff and you turn a big knob and you turn it, and some things you don't hear much, and you go, and so you fiddle with it, and other knobs you turn it and it makes a huge difference, and you make real radical moves with it, so there's a sort of tactile quality about working with this equipment. So those are the things that come into play in a large way. The difference is, I think, that because I've done it for 40 years, I spent a lot of time, lugging big, fat, huge tapes around, cutting tape, going through all the physics of it, and being so glad to reach a point where you could record and mix a song with 200 tracks in my studio here at home, and get fed up with working on it and come back a week later and suddenly go, oh, actually that was pretty good, and then get inspired again and come back and do some touch-ups and fuss around with something. I can do that with the computer. With analog, it's like, first of all, after 46 tracks, even with 46 tracks, you're dealing with $100,000 worth of tape machines and interlock systems just to get it to play back. And in a room, so you're in a room filled with tons of gear, with long wires, lots of really long wires that are probably old and crackly, that connect from the studio to the control room, and then through the patch bay with 100 patch points. And before you know it, it's amazing that things sound as good as they do in analog by the time they actually get to vinyl, because they've been through so many dodgy bits of wire. So I'm not sad to see analog go. I'm sad to see I still like those big fat old bits of gear that, especially if they're in good shape. It's really nice to see a well-maintained old Neve console or something like that, and they are great things, and they will be fun to work on. But if I had to choose, make a record with that and that only, or make a record with maybe 20 really great mic preamps, and a computer, I'll take the 20 mic preamps and a computer every day.
So I want to talk a little bit about Dream Theater, but before we do that, are there any other bands that we haven't talked about that you maybe have an interesting story about or you'd like to talk a bit about?
Porcupine Tree would be the case in point. Are you familiar with them?
A little bit, but it's good from what I've heard.
Yeah, that was the first. After I did Vapor Trails, whilst it was actually being mixed, after I'd sort of finished my role in the procedure, and Dave Leonard took over, I went off to work in New York on with Porcupine Tree, which was one of the new wave of progressive bands out of England, which was a hybrid of indulgent sort of atmospheric, experimental, progressive rock, but with a hard edge, with a nod to kind of aggressive power metal from American power metal and stuff. And they were a fantastic band. It was a great record to be involved in. And it was an out of the blue record. I got a call from my management to that this might be a good record to work on, and I went to New York and met with Steve, and he was looking for he'd produced and recorded all his records by himself at that point, starting off working in his bedroom with a couple of ADAT machines, and building a career, and was doing his first album for a major record company. And all his album budgets previously had been £10,000, I think, or about say maybe $20,000 to make a record by himself. And now he had a big budget record to spend a couple of $100,000 to make a record, and didn't really know how to go about taking advantage of that. So he needed to work with somebody that could say, okay, well, this is the great drum recording rooms to work in. This is the kind of gear we want to go for, and these are the kind of guitar amps and stuff we should get in. So that was a interesting record to do like that, and it was a very quickly done and beautiful record, and so it stands out to me as one of the records that I loved that I did. I can't think of. There are a number of others that I've had great fun doing. The I Mother Earth and Moist records that I did were great fun at the time. I Mother Earth from a sort of technical and performance point of view, and Moist from a kind of creative and kind of random point of view, because they were much looser band from a performance standpoint, but very creative. David had a very, very strong sense of his sort of artistic and spontaneous qualities in what he was doing, and I really liked him for that. And those were great records to do. So yeah, I guess that's the only thing that springs to mind, and other than and Suicidal Tendencies being an extraordinary band to work with because of both the radicalness of the medium, the sort of aggressive punk rock, but the extraordinary musicianship amongst the various musicians that have been through that band, like of insane kind of, and not very disciplined people. Some of the young musicians that have been involved, like Mike, the leader of the band, was always kind of surrounding. It's almost like being in a situation like Frank Zappa, where there was somebody that was the master of ceremonies. In Zappa's case, he was a very powerful musician in his own right.
Yeah.
In Mike Muir's case, he is a musician. He plays guitar, but he doesn't count himself as being that. But he's real visionary in terms of what he wants to achieve musically, and has gravitated to a point where he's surrounded by extraordinary musicians, but some of them are very young and very naive or very immature, and so there's a certain kind of craziness that's involved in dealing with like a 16-year-old bass players that play like Jaco Pastorius, or drummers that go on tour with very large suitcases of sneakers that cause everybody else to have to rearrange all their luggage because somebody's arrived with the new young drummer in the band's arrived with the largest suitcase ever seen, with 60 pairs of sneakers whilst he goes on tour, and nothing else. So you're dealing with strange characters but because of their upbringing and stuff, have extraordinary talent, and so that's been a lot of fun in the last 10 years. My sort of sojourns into California with Mike have been fun for that reason, because of the speed and random sort of spontaneity of these kind of crazy musicians that and often musicians that are playing outside of their normal genre, that there'll be a new drummer in the band that's, I mean, Ron Bruner, who was playing with them for a while, was 16 when he first played with 16 or 17 when he first played with Suicidal Tendencies, and was playing in a jazz club when they found him, and so half the time he was playing punk rock, and the other half the time he was playing with Stanley Clarke, which right there is a very unusual situation. And I think, interesting enough, I heard recently that one of the reasons Stanley Clarke wanted to play with him in his band was because he was playing with Suicidal Tendencies, because it was a challenging fact, that somebody with that kind of ferocious and extraordinary drum, and real school kind of jazz type of chops that he got, was playing with a punk band as well, because that's a completely different animal and different kind of intensity. But it's the over-the-topness of all the playing that I always find a lot of fun to try and capture, because yes, it's indulgent, yes, it's completely over the top, yes, it's often quite tasteless, but it's very exciting. And if you can find that balance where you maybe you aren't tasteless, I mean, I say tasteless with sort of a certain degree of sarcasm, it's, the intentionally over the top. We don't care if this is too busy. We like it like that, because it's fun. But obviously, at the end of the day, it has to all balance out, either the structure of the song or these things have to have their place. So intentional overplaying for its own sake has a place. But it becomes annoying when the overplaying it gets in the way. But sometimes it actually does have merit, and it can blow your mind. And in the case of some of his musicians, there's times when your jaw drops and you go, wow. For some reason, I've often gravitated towards working with a lot of technical musicians. So from guitar players, but technical, everything from the early days of progressive music to progressive punk, in fact, and now we were about to talk about Dream Theater, which is defined as progressive metal. So extreme musicians. And there's it's challenging and it's fun. It's not necessarily the music I listen to when I go home. As I said before, I'd much rather listen to Massive Attack, where the bass part might be one note. So, but it's fun and challenging to work on. And I hope that's, when I work with people, I hope that I sort of bring that to the table, that I'm comfortable dealing with all those kinds of crazy random stuff that's going to come at you, And yet sometimes you have to knuckle down and get real technical with stuff and make things perfect. I mean, in the case of Dream Theater, striving for things to be perfect is a huge part of what they do, in the precision in their playing and stuff. And so that's the job. That's what we're going to do today. We're going to go nuts and get more notes jammed into the next 25 minute songs, being another issue. But it's a different challenge, but it's a challenge that's very interesting. And it's, it has its own moments. There's some extraordinary stuff that I've been privileged to work on with all of these people, and Dream Theater included.
And then, so now, since we're on the topic, how do you get the call to work on Systemic Chaos?
Systematic Chaos.
Systematic, my bad.
Yeah. Well, they had called me once before, because obviously in the field they're big Rush fans, so they my name from Rush. Everybody finds different people to work with after you've worked with somebody for a number of projects. Sometimes you get comfortable, and so people want to change because they need to change. They need to be out of their comfort zone. So however much you might get along and enjoy working with different people, there are reasons to not do an album with somebody that may be just like, okay, I want to work with somebody who has a different point of view. Not, sometimes just because of that, because I know the way you think and I like the way you think, and I often agree with the way you think, but maybe I'd like to work with somebody that I don't necessarily agree with, or who I like what they do, but they do it in a different way. So that's why people get calls out of the blue to suddenly be involved in something. Dream Theater, they'd asked me. I went for a meeting like 5 years previously. I think it was the album that was done by Kevin Shirley, and then I didn't hear from them again for 5 years, and then suddenly I get a call out of the blue saying that they'd like me to do the record. Would I be interested in doing it? So yes, I was available. They're fantastic musicians. They're great guys. I like them a lot. They put me up in a apartment in New York, and we made a record, or a few of them. And the fun thing about doing a Dream Theater record was that because they essentially make most of their money is made by their touring. Making records is not particularly profitable enterprise for pretty much anybody at this point.
Yeah.
Really detailed. Some records cost a fortune to make, and they sell a fraction of what they did in their heyday. Which is not to say nobody makes money with records, but it's a massively different situation to what it is.
I think Kim Mitchell said it best. He said, you used to have 100 people selling 1 million records. Now you have 1 million people selling 100 records.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And so to make a record with Dream Theater, their attitude was like, okay, well, we're on the road a lot of the time. We don't really, usually in the past, we would have gone into a demo studio, we'd have rehearsed, we'd written the songs, we'd demo them, then we'd spend maybe a month or two doing that. Then we'd go to the studio and spend another month or two redoing things and they decided they wanted to record spontaneously. They just wanted to set up, have everything ready to record, write a song, record it, finish it, write another song, record it, finish, not mix it, but do certainly all of the bed track recording, not the vocals, because they need to write lyrics, and so the vocals were separated, but all of the musical structure of the song would need to be done. So it's a very expensive way to record, especially in New York. Fortunately, studios cost half as much now as they used to 10 years ago. In fact, maybe a third as much. So we booked into Avatar Studios in New York, set up. Basically, the entire studio was set up to record Mike Portnoy's 2 drum kits, which were simultaneously set up so he could just go, I want to play on this one, no, I want to play on that one. So out of the 40 inputs on the console, I think 36 of them we used for Mike's drum kit, and like a couple for the bass. Actually, maybe 32 with Mike's drum kit, a couple for the bass, a couple for the guitar, and then the keyboards were all fed from like an extra mixer, just going straight to tape because they were just guide keyboards anyway. So that's how we record the basics and then edit them, and because we're working on computer now, you kind of structure the songs, and then finally all the songs are structured, and there's a pretty clear rendition of the album, and then we'd start from scratch again, cut all the drums from scratch, then cut all the bass and cut all the guitar and add all the keyboards, and then go back and do all the vocals. So but the idea of just doing it's more like old school recording where you go in the studio for months, so it's not cost effective, but those guys didn't want to waste another 2 months in rehearsal studios. They just wanted to, because they were going to be out on the road for the rest of the year. They got families to deal with. They want, so that's why we did that.
I'm curious, how did you get the guitar tone on Dramatic Turn of Events?
Okay, well, basically, my approach to guitar sounds is you usually start off with, first of all, you need to have great guitars and great amps. And the guitar players, a great guitar player usually is very, very particular about all of those things. That being said, the technique for recording guitars is not very complicated. You just basically, it's varied from being the most basic way would be just using a 57, slightly off center from the cones on the speakers, very close to the front of a speaker, slightly off center to get rid of the brittleness, usually going through a Neve mic preamp, arguably set flat, maybe a little top end on it, but for the most part, and then you do all the work with the guitar and the amp, the pickup selection, the amp settings, and all of the work is done there. The variations on that, different mics using ribbon mics, there's some really great ribbon mics around now that are interesting, which are more full range, not as kind of limited range as something like a Shure 57. But when you use a Shure 57, there's this simplicity about the sound that's very focused. No 2 Shure 57s really sound the same because they're they're kind of close, but they usually often get beat up quite. So if you have 657s in the studio, try all 6 of them because one will sound better than the others. And once you've done that, you don't need to spend much time fiddling after that. In the case of when we were doing dramatic tenor for events, we decided to just go. We'd try some really new high-tech recording gear. We got some big Shadow Hills mic preamps that are like $5,000 mic preamp for a stereo pair. It was about $4,500, I think, which is really nice. And they've got really nice is probably a very descriptive way to say it. One thing that's nice about those units is that they've got multiple transformers in that you could switch in and out, or change the fundamental transformers in them, which have slightly different tones. So you get with exactly the same settings and the same gain structure, you can make some quick comparisons. They're beautifully made pieces of gear. We used a 57, but we also had one of the new very expensive Shure ribbon mics. They have a couple of ribbon mics that Shure make that are great for guitar. There's one that's about $1,000 mic that's sort of red and black, and then they have the expensive model of the same, which is about $3,000 ribbon mic, and we got one of those, and it was good. And you can pretty much put it dead center, straight on the cone, and it sounds great. And so then you do all the work with the amp. And in that sense, it's more about a dialogue between, me and, in this case, John Petrucci, kind of like experimenting with hunting for sounds. It's more about the discussion that you have about what you're trying to achieve or what he's trying to achieve, and me kind of giving him criticism or feedback on it, than it is keep fiddling with the microphones. Once you've got them in a place that you feel good about, then you just leave them and make a record.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want something significantly different, it might be change guitars or change amps, or the amp set. In these days, in his case, he's got new Boogie amps that have got almost 4 completely separate gain stages in them, so you can have 4 completely different tonal setups on one amp that you can switch through quickly without having to unplug anything and fiddle. So that's convenient. That's nice.
Is that the Mark V?
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is the most sort of flexible one that they've made yet, where they've combined a lot of different features of a lot of their amps. But sometimes he'll go back to Mark IIs or something. He's got old classics that he's always liked that have. But even he'll have 2 of the same amp, and one sounds different, and even with a lot of effort to tune them up to be in shape. There's some qualities in some. It's functions of the, I guess the transformers, the hand wiring, the bias. I mean, you presumably can bias everything the same with different ones, but whether I don't know, when you get down to the real personality of 2 identical amps and how different they sound, that it's getting into fine territory there. But with older equipment, then it's not surprising, because sometimes it might be just a brand of capacitors in it or something like that, or is causing a slightly different distortion characteristics or something like that. So you never know. Once you get hardcore with this stuff, you can go deep, and I don't usually go there. Somebody else does. I prefer it when they turn up and they go, "This is my setup. Let's record it the best we can." But in the case of, for instance, in a case of Porcupine Tree with Steve Wilson, he didn't regard himself as having a lot of experience and knowledge about getting guitar sounds. So he relied on me to say, well, what amps should I get, and should I use different guitars, and why? And he had his own basic setup, which sounded good, but he didn't. So we brought in a lot of interesting hired amplifiers and guitars, and used them for different sounds, because each has its own specialty. So that's the other side of recording, is being able to say to somebody, well, maybe you want to use 10-inch speaker, an amp with 10-inch speakers, or for more speaker breakup, or maybe you want to use a heavy overdrive amp, or maybe you want a guitar with P90s on it, with pickups, because they're single coil but fat, like but not quite as thin sounding as a Telecaster or something, but very bright like that. So because some people spend their whole life with one guitar and don't really think in terms of the way changing their guitar might change the tone of the songs and stuff like that. So.
How would you compare doing your first two records with Dream Theater to a dramatic turn of events? Obviously, by this point, Mike Portnoy had exited, Mike Mangini was now in the band. How did you find that sort of change the dynamic of the band, or did it really change anything?
Well, obviously, Mike Portnoy was a very dominant personality in the band. But from a writing point of view, John Petrucci was probably the strongest songwriter in the band. He was the one that was doing the majority of the writing. However, that being said, that Mike was very much, from a point of view of like the master of ceremonies, if you like, he was very, very influential in saying, let's do this in this style, let's go in this direction, let's do, aside from playing drums, he did write lyrics and do some singing, and I don't know what other instruments he played, but I'm sure he played other instruments besides, because his musical knowledge was significant. But it was his force of personality that was probably the most dominant feature of the creative relation. Aside from his phenomenal drumming, it was his personality that sort of dominated in that sense. So whereas John Petrucci was more quiet, but also a very strong personality. I mean, basically, he would very much kind of steer a lot of the kind of tonal direction of the arrangements and things like that, and also write a lot of the riffs and the musical parts. And so so it wasn't, the only difference was, instead of having two people dominating the writing, because Jordan was very much like a hired gun in a sense, because he was a later member of the band with extraordinary technical ability and versatility. And so the other guys had their direction. They knew where they wanted to go. They basically were a sort of progressive metal band. That's what they do. Jordan, they wanted orchestration from Jordan, but they were always battling with the fact that keyboards inherently tend to sweeten and soften the hard edge that they sometimes liked. There was times when they just liked guitar, bass, and drums, and they were having to battle with the fact that they had a monster musician standing there with keyboards that could orchestrate in an extraordinary way, who they didn't actually want right there that moment. So that was always that was the dynamic of the band. It's essentially driven by Mike and John. And then, after the drama of Mike deciding he needed a break and figuring that he wanted a break and do something new and different, and had an opportunity to do something new and different, and figured that everybody else would go along with that, because, well, if it suited him, presumably everybody else would feel the same way. It's nice to take a break, but the reality was it didn't suit anybody else at all. They all felt like, well, no, we're not going to, because Mike wanted to take a break for a couple of years, maybe 5 years, then get back together again. And the other guys obviously weren't really that interested in doing that. So then they proceeded to find a new drummer, and Mike quit the band because they didn't want him to quit the band, but it was like, okay, well, I have to quit, then I'm quitting. So then they found a new drummer, and then he parted company with the band that he was with for personal differences, and wanted to come back. So that caused a ruckus, and it was like, well, no, because everybody's moved on. And so there was a strange dynamic there. But from a point of view of the record, it was very straightforward, because basically we did demos without Mike Mangini. He was already in the band, and they'd found somebody, and they really liked his playing, and he was very complimentary to the band, and understood their music and could do anything that they wanted to do. But they wanted to focus on the songwriting or the musical structure, and so they did it all with guide drum parts, with computer drums and stuff, which John Petrucci programmed rather, and they structured everything, and then sent it all to Mike Mangini. He learnt it, so he knew how to play exactly what was written, but then subsequently, okay, now as long as you know exactly what we did do your own thing, and see if you want to bring anything different to it. But at the same time, sometimes it was because a song was written around certain kind of drum parts, he would play exactly what was there. So it was about probably 50-50 of him playing exactly what was programmed, and then him doing something that was his own kind of like completely different thing that wasn't programmed. I'm sure that the current record they're doing is now been with the band for a while. They're probably doing a lot more working together. But I know that John Petrucci, well, the guys in themselves did actually enjoy very much sitting together in a room. They were set up like it was the whole band, but instead of having a drummer, they just had, programmed the drums on the computer. The value in that is that when you've got a drum kit in the room, as soon as somebody plays a drum kit and you're standing in the room, everybody's got to put headphones on, you've got to stand there, it's loud, it's physical. That is exciting, but it forces something. You can't sit and be objective because you have to just play and make a noise and get. And so, whereas when you write stuff and you can do it in the computer, you can program something and you can turn it down if you want and sit and discuss it and play it and spin back and play and it's a different dynamic. So it meant that from a writing point of view, they could focus on the writing really, really clearly, separately from the big physical kind of drama of having, in their case, a huge drum kit in the room that's very, very loud, that if you're sitting next to it, you can't, you can't. So you have to, it's, so it was very, I think John and the other guys really enjoyed doing that. I don't know how they did the next one because Rich Chicky did the next record because I'd done 3, so it was that time. They needed a change, and so they're working with Rich now, and I'm not sure whether they going back to having Mike in the studio right from day one, Mike Mangini this time, or whether they would go back to doing it all on computer and then doing the drums separately, overdubbing the drums separately. That would be an interesting thing to know, but I know that they really enjoyed the process of being able to separate the writing from the performing, which was not true in the previous stuff that I do.
And then so now you've just finished up the new Suicidal Tendencies album. What else do you have coming up in the future?
Things are quiet right now, which is fine by me. I'm doing a couple of projects in Quebec, Eric Lapointe album and a Claude Dubois album, which is always fun to step out of. Well, Eric is very much a hard rock project anyway, but Claude Dubois is one of the Quebec's greatest singers, and is always like culturally a really interesting thing because the musical dynamic is very different, particularly with the solo artists and songwriting being a very different kind of approach. So which is great because I'm able to do it at home. I'm anticipating doing some more stuff with Mike Muir in California in the future, possibly some Infectious Grooves in the start of the next year. But right now I'm taking a break a bit because it's been a busy year. I did another project in Texas as well in the beginning of the year with a young band called Purple with a woman singer drummer who is a powerhouse. She's extraordinary. And a 3-piece band, and that was really a fun project which I did in El Paso, Texas, which is another whole world unto itself.
Yep.
Right across the street from Juarez, the most dangerous city in the world.
Wow.
So, but that was fun. So, keeping busy and enjoying life at the moment.
Well, that's nice too. After all this work, right? You finally get to kick back a little bit and reap some of the rewards.
Yeah, no, it's good, and modern technology is making that not too difficult because people send me projects to mix at home, and I can do it, and send stuff over the internet back and forth, and so it's good. You sometimes you want to be around a lot of people, and sometimes it's nice to be able to just do a bit of work by yourself, and people appreciate it, and it's really good.
Mm-hmm. So Paul, I want to thank you very much for taking the time out to do this interview, and I mean we're pushing 3 hours now, so.
Yeah, I thought that might happen. I tend to get going, and it was actually nice to just talk freely without actually I completely forgot about it being an interview most of the time, which is probably why it's 3 hours long.
Yeah.
Not to mention I've half written the book now, which is really good.
Yeah,
so.
yeah, that's true. But yeah, Paul, so thanks again. It's much appreciated.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure talking to you.
Yep, same here.
Okay.
All right, take it easy.
Bye.